Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Marjorie Margulies. She's a former Democratic congresswoman from Pennsylvania and happens to be Chelsea Clinton's mother-in-law. Also in D.C. is Republican strategist Mica Mosbacher. And from New York is Alexandra Rojas. She's the executive director of Justice Democrats, a progressive political action committee. I thank you all for joining us here on the panel. So, the midterms came and went, and we're looking at the results, and we've got a bit of a scorecard now. Mica Mosbacher, the president, still tweeting, tremendous success tonight after the results came in, even though he lost the House. The Republicans lost the House. The president still sees it as a success. Is he being a bit naive here?
Not at all. Actually, we look at the margins in these midterm elections, and Obama had a disastrous first midterm election, and Trump only lost 23 seats, but he gained 4 to 5 seats. We're still waiting on the outcome in Arizona. So these net gains are very rare. It's happened only 4 times in history. And this was, by the way, one of the most expensive midterms ever, and the year for women. We gained a Republican senator, female, for the first time from Tennessee. Also, first time 2 Muslim women were elected to Congress, and first time in Massachusetts a black congressman was elected. So there were a lot of firsts last night, and the Dems did have a good night. And this is going to be challenging now because I think the Democratic Party and the Republican Party need to find a way to work together. Otherwise, we will be gridlocked in the House and nothing will get passed.
Yeah, and that's interesting. The question is whether there's a president with the appetite for working with the other side. Marjorie, let's look at the big picture, right? So clearly, of course, Trump is in control of the White House. He's the president. That's the executive branch. But the Republicans have the Senate, right? And they have a right-leaning or Republican-leaning Supreme Court in the country. Is it enough for the Democrats after these midterms to just merely have the House of Representatives, Marjorie?
I think that this was a referendum on the president. Would we have liked to have done better? Sure. We flipped 28 seats. I thought we were going to do more, but who knew? Many of them by women. The real conversation, as far as I'm concerned, is now, especially down ballot, people are saying stop. The tone is terrible. Stop doing this to the president. We're an embarrassment worldwide. What are the words that are coming out of his mouth? And even though we didn't do as well as some of us had hoped, we flipped the House. We did an extraordinary job down ballot. We now have 100 women in the House. In my state, in Pennsylvania, we didn't have a woman on our delegation. When I served, I was the only woman on our delegation. Now we have at least 4. We may have more, but we have 4 women on the delegation. It's a different conversation, but I think that this was a referendum on the president, and the country is saying, we're divided for sure. The country is saying, stop. Stop being so mean.
But Marjorie,
stop
sorry to interrupt you, Marjorie. Sorry to interrupt you, right? But if it really was a referendum where people were saying stop, wouldn't we then expect the Democrats to win both the Senate and the House, and by a landslide? It was a referendum, and it seems as if some people were saying stop and some people were saying please continue.
You're right. You're right. And for me, and I've been out campaigning a lot, for me, I'm still surprised at how many people are willing to accept what is being said. I'm glad that there were enough people out there who said, we're going to flip the House and we're going to put more women in, which I think the importance for me is that the down ballot races, the bench, which we are hoping to see over the next decade, after the census in 2020, and then when we do redistricting in 2022, that will flip, and that state houses will flip. Typically, Democrats haven't been as interested in down ballot races. What happened around the country was fascinating. Women who never would have thought of running. In many of the states where down ballot races go unchallenged. They were challenged in some states where down ballot races were unchallenged, like 70%, not one went unchallenged this time. And women came in and ran. Teachers.
Right.
And I have a lot of kids, so I mean, the important thing for me, not in a universal sense, but the important thing for me is that young kids, girls, boys, went out with their mothers who never would have thought of running, and figured out what a democracy is all about. Let me go back to the fact that this president is an embarrassment, and people were stepping up in numbers, not big enough for me, but in numbers that counted, that said, stop it.
Okay, and for presumably half the country, he's not an embarrassment and they still support him. Alexandra Rojas, looking at the results of this election from the perspective of the left, from a progressive perspective, are you disappointed that you didn't do as well as perhaps you might have wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to what Marjorie was saying, the results are slightly, disappointing, and they're painful for millions of Americans, especially when you think about the amount of voter suppression and gerrymandering that continues to allow so many unpopular Republicans to remain in power. But I think the most important victory of the night still belongs to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who we at Justice Democrats recruited, trained, and were instrumental in helping across the finish line. And that is one of the biggest political upsets, I think, in American history. And I think the idea of continuing to push Democrats to run on a big vision only is compounded. I think we saw a number of candidates run on this bold, multiracial, populist platform, including policies like Medicare for All, fighting mass incarceration, rejecting corporate donations. When you see rallies throughout the country of where the grassroots base is with the Democratic Party. And so we can't be so short-sighted to think that it all can happen in one election. I think we're going to see places like Texas, right, where Beto O'Rourke almost pulled it off, not only turn purple, but win in our generation, as Alexandria mentioned.
Yeah, some people see Texas as the bellwether for the country. And just for those who don't know who Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is, 29 years old. She's the youngest woman ever elected to the U.S. House. She's 29 years old and a New York Democrat. Let me bring in Mica here. So, Mica, there are those who look at it and think, okay, for the next 2 years, the House of Representatives is going to try and make life difficult for Trump, right? So we have the Mueller investigation. After that, we're going to have, I guess, there's an intel committee that folds into the House, which is going to look at Trump's finances. They're going to look into any dodgy dealings he might have done in the past. They might even try to impeach him. Does he care, Mica, and are the Republicans worried?
No, I mean, the Democrats will do what they're going to do. I don't think it's good for the country to look at impeachment, for example. It was very difficult in 1998, 1999 during those hearings involving President Clinton. I think that going forward, what this country has signaled is that they would like to see some accomplishments. And President Trump did try to reach across the aisle on immigration, for example, and also on infrastructure. And the Democrats wouldn't work with him. He's the art of the deal president. He's a pragmatic businessman. And he does have a strong record of accomplishments to run on, especially a roaring economy and 3.7% record unemployment. And so the Dems will have to deliver some sort of accomplishments to their constituents in 2020 to gain any traction. So while they did have a good night, I think they have a long way to go in terms of keeping up with President Trump and his staggering achievements this past 2 years.
Okay, and so Marjorie, tactically, what's the better thing for the Democrats to do? For the next 2 years, make life hell for him because they control the House, or find a way to work with him even though he might be an embarrassment, as you say?
I agree. I agree. I think we've got to, the Democrats would be smart not to go in and not to be bombastic, to start to get things done, and listen and be compromisers, which this past Congress and actually for quite a few years before they have not been. I can remember when we came in the Year of the Woman, we went and we said, okay, Let's get things done. There are things on the back burner. Family and medical leave, reasonable gun control, the automatic weapons ban. Let's figure out how we can get that done. I don't think that we can, unfortunately, touch anything on gun control with this country right now.
Right.
But let's get things done. I think it's silly, too early, ridiculous to talk about impeachment until we figure out what the information is. I do think something that we have to look at is that we have new chairs of committees. Energy and Commerce will be Pallone. Nita Lowey is taking over appropriations. The Nadler.
Right.
A lot of the people who have been sitting back and trying to be careful ranking members are now going to be chairing committees. But I agree. What we've got to do is get in there, be reasonable, see if we can compromise, which hasn't happened in a really long time, and get things done.
Right, right. Mica, I'm going to give you 20 seconds to respond before I thank you and bring in someone else. Go ahead, Mica.
Yes, well, we were discussing earlier President Trump's tone, and it was interesting. In a rare moment of self-reflection, he said in an interview yesterday that he wondered if he should have softened his tone. I would argue very strongly that during 2016, when he ran as a disruptor, that people were expecting him to come on strong, and that was really one of the selling points of his personality. But I think he is growing in his role as a statesman, and I think that he very much wants to accomplish something for the greater good of this nation.
Okay, Mica Mosbacher, I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. We're going to bring in Mark Burns now in Easley, South Carolina. He's a former Republican congressional candidate and a pastor who served on Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board. So, Pastor Burns, what we have globally, generally, and this might be a stereotype, this might be wrong. A lot of people see the Trump presidency as an extension of, I guess, institutional racism, of white privilege, of something that's the old school. And it's not a presidency for minorities. It's not a presidency for African Americans. You're a black Trump supporter. Tell us why it's different for you, and tell us what you think of the midterm elections.
Well, first of all, I think it's a horrible, horrible characterization of President Trump's presidency as one that is bigoted or racist. The fact of the matter is, as of yesterday, one of the polls of Trafalgar group polls just polled that 36% of black Americans are now supporting President Trump. It is double from this time last year. The fact is, leaders like myself and Candace Owens, black leaders like myself, who are campaigning across the country, getting people off of the Democratic plantation, reminding them that for the last 8 years, we had President Obama, and now 8 years, we were high on food stamps, high on welfare, and we were consistently less homeowners and business owners. But now under President Trump, economy, unemployment for black Americans is at an all-time historically low. So that means black people are working. And they're discovering that it is through the policies of President Trump, beyond this divisiveness that comes from mainstream media, liberals and Democrats, but through his policies, black people's lives are becoming better. Just yesterday in the midterms, I campaigned heavily in Rick Scott in Florida and for Ron DeSantis, and we're discovering through the exit polls, Ron DeSantis and Rick Scott won by 14% of the black vote. Black vote played such a historically played a high part in electing Ron Scott and DeSantis in gaining Florida.
Right.
And
okay.
so
okay.
I beg to differ.
Certainly. Okay. So, Alexandra, for the progressive platform that you have, and I don't want to mischaracterize it, but generally, the message is this is a president who's bad for minorities. So when you have a black Trump supporter who's saying, actually, that's all nonsense, your response is what?
I mean, as a woman of color who comes from an immigrant family, I just disagree with that flat out. I think that I think, you know, what I'm talking about is a common sense vision. And I will say that I think the Democrats need to run on that. They need to not necessarily, you could call it compromise, but I actually think that we need to stop letting the far right lead the agenda and actually put forth a vision that calls for, a mobilization against climate change on the scale of World War II, expanded and improved Medicare for all, mass incarceration and, fighting mass incarceration and deportation, actually champion policies that are going to inspire people to come out across all backgrounds, whether that's women, people of color, and working people of all backgrounds. So I just absolutely reject the notion that, you can pick and choose brown and black people who support both sides. I'm sure you can find that. But I do think that the progressive vision is the one that actually benefits and creates an America for all of us.
Pastor Mark Burns.
Well, I mean, the reality of it is that when you look at all of the major cities, inner cities in America, which are, again, high crime rate, high unemployment, high welfare recipients are in some of the nation's largest inner cities, which are led by Democrats. It is just a caricature or an outward expression of the Democratic policies that has essentially enslaved our people for the last, 50, 60 years. Again, there's a reason why 36% of black Americans are now supporting President Donald Trump. There's a reason why that black economy is rising. Even in small businesses, the black small businesses is the backbone of black unemployment in America. That now black entrepreneurs are gaining greater access to funds and great access to resources so that they can expand their businesses and hire more from our community. The fact is, all of this notion that there's a certain policy that's, again, let's just be clear. There isn't one policy that's designed just for somebody because of the color of the skin. We're all Americans. And when the tide rises, all boats in the tide rise together.
Okay, well, before I take a break, Marjorie, big picture, would you accept that 2 years ago, Democrats and progressives underestimated Trump supporters, didn't take them as seriously as maybe they should have, and in 2018, for sure, that is not the case. Can we all agree on that, Marjorie?
I hope so. I think you're right. I think your guest I think he was born on a sunny day. If you go to any community, any African-American community, I've been working with him for a long time, Trump is not seen as a warm, fuzzy, embracing person. I mean, I've been working with immigration, with immigrant communities and refugees for years. We all come from refugee communities. We hosted, our family hosted for 25 years, we hosted a refugee family. The youngest child in that family, who is 4 now, who was 4 then, is now an anesthesiologist. I mean, we shudder to think about the conversation that Trump is having with regard to refugees and immigrants. It's sad. Yes, there is a percentage of folks, but think about it. Most of it started, the foundation started with Obama, our first black president. I think it's fantasy to think that this president is going to be embraced by minority communities.
Okay, we're going to take a deeper dive into immigration, America and how it perceives the other. And we're going to have a closer look at women because, this was brought up at the very top of the program, later on in the program. But for the moment, let me thank you, Marjorie. Let me thank you, Alexandra, and Pastor Mark Burns. It's been a pleasure having you all on the Newsmakers. Stay with us.